My name is Malcolm Chalmers. I'm the Deputy Director General here at RUSI, and it's my great pleasure to invite you all to the 6th Annual PONI Conference. These events keep getting bigger and better, and you are the people who apply for this conference in good time, because there were quite a large number of people, unfortunately, we weren't able to accommodate because it was such a popular event. So a double welcome to you all. Can I first of all just start with an important housekeeping point? There is no fire alarm scheduled for today, so if the fire alarm does go off, then you should pay careful attention. And Andrea Berger and the other RUSI staff will, at that point, lead you deliberately but rapidly towards the appropriate fire exits, and will accumulate outside in Whitehall. I don't anticipate that happening, but of course you never know what's going to happen at a RUSI conference. The programme in front of you, as you will see, is a deliberate balance between civil and military aspects of nuclear issues. It's a balance between technical and policy issues, but most of all it's designed to give a mix of generations, with a particular focus on younger generations, an opportunity to discuss these issues in a civilized fashion. And that's why we have that code of conduct in the delegate pack, because without having a civilized discourse about what are very difficult and sometimes controversial issues, we won't make this the important learning experience we wish it to be. I can't summarize it any better than was said, I think, by the US President Peter Sellers in Dr. Strangelove. Some of you will know, no fighting in the war room. So that's a good guidance to us all, I think, on discussing these important issues. Pay attention also to the rules of procedure for each session, which again will be repeated to you for each panel, but they differ slightly in terms of whether they can be attributed publicly. This particular panel will be entirely on the record. I think one of the reasons that it's important to bring people from such a diverse range of backgrounds together to look at these issues is, as you advance in your careers and take on positions of increasing responsibility, if you're not aware already, and I think most of you will be, of the unique and indeed somber responsibilities that come with the possession of nuclear technology, whether military or civilian. When we look at international affairs and we look at Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin or future possible presidents of the United States or prime ministers of the United Kingdom or France, it's not incidental to our appraisal of their individual fitness for office, whether they're capable of taking on the somber responsibilities of being in charge of these weapons. But that's not a responsibility that's held only at head of state level. The responsibility of ensuring the safety and security of nuclear technology is held by everybody involved at every level of the nuclear industry and those in government responsible for overseeing it. And that's why safety and security are absolutely central to the nuclear enterprise in this country and indeed in most other countries. And exploring what that means is, I think, a very important part of the agenda before you today. Let me turn then to the very distinguished panel we have in front of you today, which will be focusing on the upcoming debate that the House of Commons Parliament will have at some time after the referendum. We're not sure entirely when. It may be before the summer, but it may be later this year, on the government's plans for producing a successor submarine, and on the principle of continuous at-sea deterrence, which underpins that programme. So there will be a parliamentary debate later this year, and we've asked our panellists to address the question whether the government has made a case for that proposition. But of course, the wider context for that discussion is a recognition that in our country, although there may be a majority view on the issue of Britain's nuclear deterrent, there's not a consensus view. It's an issue that's been debated, contested, interrogated endlessly ever since we became a nuclear weapons state in the 1950s, and I think rightly so. This is a terrible weapon. President Obama's recent visit to Hiroshima was a recognition of the historic importance of the events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and it's dominated many aspects of our age through the Cold War, but also, I think, subsequently in different forms. The question, of course, having recognized the uniqueness and the unique horror of nuclear weapons, is what to do about it. There are those who argue that the very horror of nuclear weapons has produced a relative peace between the major powers out of the paradox of nuclear deterrence, that the very horror of these weapons makes peace possible and indeed likely. But there's also been a debate about whether nuclear weapons, on contraire, mean that nuclear disarmament is urgent and much more urgent than in relation to conventional weapons. And of course, there's been our own national debate about, given that wider context, whether the UK, as one of the first powers involved in developing this technology during the Manhattan Project in World War II, should remain a nuclear weapon power itself. And I think because of that debate in our country, there's always been an attempt to balance deterrence and disarmament, and that's reflected in current government policy. I think it's been reflected in policy for decades now. But the balance between those two objectives has not been uncontested, and our panellists will address whether they think the government's getting that balance right or not. And as those of you who've seen who our panellists are, you'll realise that they may well have slightly different views on the question before us, which will create a really great discussion. We're going to ask each of the panellists just to say a few words on the question as to whether the government has yet made the case for the successor, and then I will ask them a number of questions which have been submitted in advance to ourselves to take us through the rest of the session. And I'd like to start by asking Dr. Julian Lewis, MP, who is chair of the House of Commons Defence Committee, has a long and distinguished record not only on speaking but writing and publishing on this issue, and will be no stranger to many of you. Julian, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, Malcolm, thank you very much indeed for the invitation. And can I take this opportunity of paying tribute to RUSI in general? Our relationship as the Defence Select Committee with RUSI is of the utmost importance. Whenever we need expert advice, RUSI is usually top of the list of people we approach, and Malcolm in particular has been unstinting in the help that he's given us, help that sometimes I think he may feel we've taken undue advantage of. For example, his brilliant analysis of defence expenditure and the 2% pledge, which we shamelessly drew on for our own study into the subject. There is a considerable difference between the debate that's being held on the subject now of nuclear deterrence and whether Britain should renew the Trident submarine fleet, and the arguments that were held in the 1980s. In the 1980s, there were far more suspicions of bad faith, and the reason for that was that we were locked in a Cold War ideological confrontation, and that there were some people who were highly political in the way in which they brought forward the case for disarmament. Political in the sense of having an outlook that was, shall we say, not entirely aligned with Western democratic values. All that is over. And the relationship, I think it's true to say, between those who argue in Parliament against renewing Trident and those, or I should say the submarines for Trident at this stage, and those like me who argue strongly in favour of it, is entirely based on our mutual shared concern to discover and to, if possible, enact the best method of preventing the horror of a nuclear war taking place. Now, Malcolm, you ask whether the government has yet presented its case. And the answer is, it has and it hasn't. And what I mean by that is that it presents its case whenever it can be pinned down to talk about it. But one thing which I think, and Brendan and Emily will correct me if I'm wrong, but one thing which I think all of us on the panel have agreed on is that the government ought to get on with it. I certainly have made common cause with people from other parties in Parliament who feel that there has been a danger of playing politics with the question of renewing Trident, in the sense that this has been seen as a stick by some people, shall we say, in the government with which to beat the opposition parties. And the reality of the matter is, and I think it's an open secret, that everybody from the highest reaches of the Ministry of Defence downwards thought that the case was going to be made and the debate was going to be held round about late January or early February of this year. And the fact that it was put off for political reasons. Now, as I only have 5 minutes, I shall do my best to set out what I regard as the 6 main arguments for keeping the British nuclear strategic deterrent and continuing with CAS-D. And I'm sorry that I'll be racing through them a bit, but needs must. And I hope then that that will give some traction for people then to decide where they think there are holes in the government case. Here's the first argument. The first argument is that future military threats and conflicts will be no more predictable than those which engulfed us throughout the 20th century. This is the overriding justification for preserving any armed forces in peacetime as a national insurance policy. No one knows which enemies might confront us during the next 30 to 50 years, and that's the period we're talking about deploying the next generation of Britain's strategic nuclear deterrent. But it's highly probable that at least some of these threats will come from adversaries or potential adversaries armed with mass destruction weapons. The second argument is that it's not the weapons themselves that we have to fear, but the nature of the regimes which possess them. Whereas democracies are generally reluctant to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear dictatorships, although they did against Japan in 1945, the reverse is not true. Think, for example, of a scenario of a non-nuclear Britain in 1982 facing an Argentina in possession of even a few tactical nuclear bombs and the means of delivering them. Would we then have dared to use our conventional superiority to send a task force, knowing that we could be faced with a tactical nuclear threat mounted by a regime that was entirely undemocratic and therefore much more uninhibited? Thirdly, the United Kingdom has traditionally played a more important and decisive role in preserving freedom than other medium-sized states have been able or willing to do. Democratic countries without nuclear weapons have little choice but to declare themselves neutral and hope for the best, or to join an alliance and rely upon the nuclear umbrella of powerful allies. The United Kingdom is a nuclear power already and is also much harder to defeat by conventional means because of our physical separation from the continent. Fourthly, our prominence as the principal ally of the United States, our strategic geographical position, and the fact that we are obviously the junior partner might tempt an aggressor at some stage in the future to risk attacking us separately. Given the difficulty of overrunning the United Kingdom with conventional forces, in contrast to our more vulnerable continental allies, an aggressor could be tempted to use one or more mass destruction weapons against us on the assumption that the United States would not reply on our behalf. Even if that assumption were wrong, the attacker would find out his mistake when, and only when, it was too late for all concerned. By contrast, an independently controlled British nuclear deterrent massively reduces the prospect of such a fatal miscalculation. Fifth, no quantity of conventional forces can compensate for the military disadvantage which faces a non-nuclear country in a conflict with a nuclear-armed enemy. The atomic bombing of Japan is especially instructive, not only because the emperor was forced to surrender, but also in terms, and I always like to look at these things this way, of the reverse scenario. Imagine if Japan had developed nuclear bombs in the summer of 1945 and the Allies had not. An invasion to end the war would then have been out of the question. So those are my 6 main arguments. I suspect my time is up, otherwise I'd give you the 4 political arguments as well, but maybe those can come out in the question section. Thank you very much.
Julian, thank you very much indeed for your 6 theses, admirably succinct and very clear, and I'm sure much to think about there. It's now my great pleasure to ask Emily Thornberry, who is the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, to speak to us. Emily, thank you.
So the question that we consider today is whether the government has made a convincing case for the successor programme. But in many ways, the more fundamental question is, why has there been no proper attempt to put a case forward? Let me put it this way. If there was any other procurement decision, a number of questions would need to be answered in order to make that case. So number 1, what is the current operational requirement? Number 2, what uses will it have and what challenges will it face in the future operational environment? Number 3, what is the total cost of bringing it into operation? 4, are there more cost-effective alternatives? And 5, and perhaps most importantly, do the benefits outweigh the costs? To my mind, none of these questions have been fully answered by this government, and if not, how can we determine whether the case has been made? Let's look at the money, for example. The latest in a series of rapidly escalating estimates in the past year puts the cost of manufacturing the submarines alone at £41 billion. On the cost of the warhead, the maintenance, and the associated infrastructure, there has been only silence. When we press the Ministry of Defence, we get the official response that they need, quote, a safe space away from public gaze to consider their options, quote, unfettered from public comment about their affordability. Now, how can we even debate whether the government has made a case for the successor when they're still in their safe space considering their options? But there is another issue on which it is equally disturbing. There is an equally disturbing silence. In the past, when major decisions have been made on the future of Britain's nuclear capability, they have gone hand in hand with a strong commitment to eventual multilateral nuclear disarmament. Indeed, Labour's original decision to renew Trident in 2007 was accompanied by the following statement from the then Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett. She said, "If we allow our efforts on disarmament to slack, the nuclear shadow that hangs over us will lengthen and it will deepen. So my commitment to the vision of a world free from nuclear weapons is undimmed." If you go back further to 1957 and the Labour conference in Brighton, when Nye Bevan made his impassioned speech on the retention of the deterrent, one line from his speech is best remembered, but it is worth recalling what preceded it. Bevan said, "It is not a question of who is in favour of the bomb, but a question of what is the most effective way of getting the damn thing destroyed. And it is the most difficult of all problems facing mankind." That was the basis of his plea that no British Foreign Secretary should be sent naked into the conference chamber. And 6 decades on, 60 years on, what would Bevan make of the fact that the bombs are still with us, now in more countries than ever? But the conference chamber he talked about lies silent and empty. And while there are many other equally difficult problems now facing mankind, like climate change, like terrorism, like global poverty, and the state of the world economy, we see huge attention paid to each of those problems, whilst almost none is being paid to the issue of disarmament. It was also a Labour government, Harold Wilson's, that agreed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 to pursue negotiations in good faith on a treaty on general and complete disarmament. The NPT was effectively a bargain. It was a bargain between the countries that had nuclear weapons and pledged to disarm, and the countries that didn't have weapons and promised not to develop them. And as an original signatory to the NPT, the UK, in my view, has a particular obligation to respect the treaty and to ensure that others do the same. Margaret Beckett, again, said, "For any generation, that would be a noble calling. For ours, it is a duty. But under this government, that duty has been deserted. That is why we hear the growing frustration of the majority of the world's countries with the inertia on nuclear disarmament from countries like our own. We're even being sued by the Marshall Islands in the International Court for what they see as our failure to keep our word. So my challenge to the government, and those on the other side of the debate today, is this. Tell us the costs of the successor. How long will it take to deliver? Tell us the operational needs and challenges and what they will be in 30 years' time. And as I have said today, tell us how it fits in with the strategy for eventual multilateral disarmament in line with the treaties that we have signed. Answer those questions, and then we can start to debate whether you have made that case.
Emily, thank you very much indeed for that very powerful case. For our third speaker, we have Brendan O'Hara MP, who was first elected at the last election as the MP for Argyll and Bute, and therefore represents Fastlane and Coolport in his constituency. But he is also the SNP spokesman for defence issues, and therefore very much in the front line of the forthcoming debate. Brendan, over to you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Like the other two speakers, I would agree that the case for the successor programme has not been made, convincing or otherwise, because we have not had the debate. I think it's quite astonishing that at Westminster no government time has been given over to debate Trident and its successor programme for almost a decade. And it's only ever been the SNP who in our own time have brought the debate about the successor programme to the floor of the House of Commons. I believe it will be left once again to the SNP to provide the only coherent and united voice against renewal when eventually it is debated. And we'll do that with the mandate we received from the Scottish people in 2015, and one which was renewed just last month at the Scottish parliamentary elections when the overwhelming majority of Scots voted for parties opposed to Trident renewal. And I think there is a convincing case against renewal that can be made on moral, economic and military grounds. And in the minutes I have available to me, I'd like to put forward what I see as the military case against renewal. I returned late last night from 3 days in Brussels after a series of meetings with political and military leaders at NATO and SHAPE. As you can imagine, there was much to discuss, particularly how NATO and the EU would deal with the consequences of a Brexit. But among the many things we discussed, time and time again we returned to the question of Russia. Russia, we were told, is playing fast and loose with international law. And it's breaking every rule and convention with its use of asymmetrical hybrid war, cyber terrorism, and its attempts to destabilise its Baltic neighbours. And it was described to us by NATO commanders as the greatest risk that we currently face. To combat this risk, NATO doesn't just need boots on the ground in the shape of the Rapid Response Force, it also requires an enhanced conventional capability with air and sea defences. And there must also be serious investment in countering Russia's cyber programme at far, far in excess of the paltry $1.9 billion that's been set aside in this year's SDSR for cyber security. But while there's a real and genuine threat unfolding on our Eastern European borders, the UK is planning to spend at least £41 billion on 4 new submarines, submarines whose lifetime costs could be in excess of £200,000 million. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that nowadays you don't need nuclear bombs to undermine and hold a people to ransom. The ability to take control of banks, the means of communication and energy supplies is a very, very powerful weapon and would be much, much better served by spending some of those billions in protecting our people and our vital national interest from cyber attacks. But it's not just Russia that's providing or posing that threat. The threat from this rapidly changing world is becoming all too clear, and it is challenging us to look at the assumptions that we've taken for granted. The refugee crisis that we're witnessing in the Middle East and in North Africa is a potent and extremely worrying example of the problems we'll have to face as we head into the mid-part of this new century. Climate change and the search for natural resources, economic pressure will result in mass migration of people on a scale never seen before, so that by 2040, 70% or more of the world's population will be urban dwellers. Mega cities will emerge across South America, Africa, and across Asia, and the clamour for scarce resources will put pressure on already struggling infrastructure and could become unbearable, bringing with it unprecedented security problems. The UK will be faced with the problem of how it deals with this new world, and the choices that we make now will determine what we can do then. As General Sir Richard Sheriff told the Defence Select Committee last year, you either go down the line of nuclear capability at the expense of conventional capability or conventional capability at the expense of nuclear. It seems to be that sort of zero-sum game. Yet because the United Kingdom is so enthralled to retaining its status as a nuclear power, we refuse to have that debate. The United Kingdom does not need Trident, but it's what the United Kingdom wants. And I think that leads to very, very bad government. Just last week, the president of the biggest nuclear power on earth, the only power who have fired a nuclear weapon in anger, visited the scene of that explosion. President Obama said, "Those nations like my own that hold nuclear stockpiles, we must have the courage to escape the logic of fear and pursue a world without them." If the President of the United States has the courage to make that statement, surely we can find the courage to escape that logic of fear and begin the process of nuclear disarmament, or at very least not escalate it further through renewal. But for as long as United Kingdom politicians view these weapons as a national virility symbol, we cannot have that serious debate. Trident is a political weapon. It is not a military weapon. In the decade Since any government last debated Trident, the world has changed almost beyond recognition. The threats are more complex and more nuanced than ever before. Yet we're being asked to believe that the solution remains the same. A nuclear-armed submarine patrolling the seas 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. By going down the road of nuclear at the expense of conventional capability, we risk leaving ourselves and our allies exposed and our immediate threats unchecked, because Trident is a 21st century answer to a 20th century answer to a 21st century problem. We need to find effective solutions to the dangers we face now, and we need to stop posturing and wasting tens, if not hundreds of billions on submarines that may well be outdated and redundant before they hit the water. There has been no case convincing otherwise made for the renewal of Trident, because there has been no serious debate, and I think that is an appalling indictment of the UK's politicians.
Brendan.